test this and make sure it's working. There have been some issues with, I don't know, live streaming from these computers. So let me make sure that that's working. So that's good. Okay. So I'm sorry I was gone last time. I'm sure you were heartbroken over, not having class. Education is the one thing where less is more. The less I give you, the happier you are with it. I did give you a video that you could watch, and if you watch that, some of this will be redundant because I am going to cover it a little bit today. So just as kind of a refresher, so let me ask a question. Let me start with this. Given the fact that we talked about the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance being critically important, given that fact, and given the fact that knowledge is, doubling at an enormously quick rate, I think I've told you all that, from the first part of the Common Era, when we get a lot of recorded history until something like, the 14th century, knowledge only doubled one time. And so and now knowledge is doubling so quickly, and the things that we thought we knew are in many instances not what we know, right? Because science progresses. People thought, the best scientific minds of the past thought that the sun revolved around the earth, and that's turned out to not be true. So given the fact that everything is so quick, the way we market today has changed radically just in the last several years. I remember when the internet became widely available to the mass public, and it was largely static pages, and we thought that was really impressive, that you could get all of this information at your fingertips in static form. It didn't have a lot that went along with it. And then we got pictures, and we had dial-up now, and that was a new way of marketing, and that's been within my lifetime. And now even the way that we market has changed radically in the last 4 or 5 years. Probably the way you interact with marketing has changed radically in the last 4 or 5 years. When the internet first came out, and for a big portion of the internet's history, to the extent that it was used by commercial enterprises, the way we interacted with it was initially on a desktop through a landline dial-up, and then through laptop computers, and now through mobile marketing. And so one of the biggest courses that we now have that has really taken off is called social media marketing. And social media marketing is not even doing it on your laptops anymore. It's now largely being done on your phone. How many of you use your phone for virtually everything? A lot of you do. You log into your banking account. So what could some Greeks that lived, 2,500 years ago have to tell us today when they couldn't have fathomed this device? So is this history of the discipline, is it, for both ethics and marketing, is it relevant in the modern world? Or have things changed so radically that we need to not pay attention to what they said and maybe come up with new ethical paradigms? Or are they still important? Go ahead.
I would say they're still important because it's still the same. People are still greedy and like to do unethical stuff. It has the same underlying basics. Like, it's more complicated technically, but you're still doing it for money or whatever because you want something. So I say it's like the basis is the same. It's more like it's the structure. And like, we have a bigger house now, but at the base it's still the same base. So
Right. I think you're right. I think that is somewhat correct in that we are doing things in a different way, but we're still, in many respects, using the same things. We still have to have clothing. Now the clothing and the styles change, but we're still having to buy clothing. We're still buying products, some of which are good, some of which are bad. What did you want to add to it? Nothing? You raised your hand.
Did I?
Yeah.
I don't think it'd be.
Oh, okay, all right. And it was one of those phantom
I guess.
hand raisings that we have phantom vibrations from our phones. Now we've got phantom hand raising apparently in the professor's mind, because I would have sworn your hand went up to answer
I'll
the
get the
question.
next one though.
Okay. Just want to make sure you get your ducks, so everybody gets an opportunity. So I think that is correct. And the method of manipulation that we can engage in as marketers has changed. But the underlying problem of ethical manipulation has not. And so it turns out that a lot of these guys that lived, a long time ago are pretty cogent even in a modern reading of them. And so looking at these three great questions, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance, what we find is that you can answer these questions without using ethics. I can think of two other ways that you can answer these questions, the question of knowledge, conduct, and governance. How can you answer them? Actually, I could come up with probably three, but maybe the third is just a category of the second two. How can you answer these questions without using philosophy? For most of ancient history, people didn't use philosophy to answer these questions. There was a lot of civilization going on, and maybe not a lot of philosophical thought going on, which leads to interesting results when you don't use philosophy to answer these three questions.
Is it more just out of logic?
Out of logic, okay, by understanding the steps and processes that we go through in making decisions and evaluating those decisions against evidence, all right? The way for most of human history that people answered these questions was either through what we call a mythology. The Greeks had this complex mythology. That's what we would call a dead religion or a false religion today. Or you can answer this question through religion. You can answer these questions through religion. Both of those are problematic. Why are they problematic? Well, if we answer them using a mythology or a religious basis, what we end up with is, how are we going to determine whose mythology or religion we're going to use? If we looked at the United States, this is a huge debate. There's a feeling in the US that we need, one of the reasons that we have as many problems as we have experienced is because we've taken that old-time religion out of school. We've taken prayer out of school. Maybe that's the solution, is to put prayer back in the school. What's wrong with that?
Not everybody has the same religion.
Not everybody has the same religion. Even within Christianity, overwhelmingly, Americans identify as Christians. But even within that religion, in the world's greatest religions, I think there are 7 of them. If I can remember all of them, there's Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, right? Of the 3 monotheistic religions, Judaism is the oldest and the foundation for the other 2. So even within the subset of monotheistic religions, Christianity, whose book are we going to use? There are radical differences between versions of the Bible. The Catholic Bible is somewhat different than the Protestant Bible. What was the foundation for the Protestant Bible? Anybody know? For most,
Martin Luther? No.
he's the foundation for a breakaway, but the actual version comes from King James the First of England, and it's called the King James Version. It's interesting because he writes all of this stuff and he comes up with a sort of common Protestant Bible. And he's adamantly opposed to homosexuality in his writings and things like that. And yet it turns out he was what? Anybody know?
Homosexual?
He was homosexual. Yeah. I mean, he had a wife and he had lots of kids, but he was probably, based on the best evidence, he was fairly kind of flamboyantly gay. It was not a big secret at court, in the English court. So whose book are we going to use, the Catholic or the King James? There's also even versions that are newer, that go beyond that in terms of differences. A lot of the newer churches, the seeker churches, are using things called the New International Version, the NIV Bible, which is writing it down, taking all of the, he begat and all of those sort of archaic words out and writing them in a more common parlance and making it, more accessible to today's laity. There's also the Mormons have a second book, right? So we're going to use the Mormon Bible. They've got a second book called the Book of Mormon. And you can see where these problems are gonna create issues if we rely on one of those three. I guess the third way that I can think of that you could come up with answers is you could just do it by gut. Like my senses tell me that this is right or wrong, just sort of the gut check. I see it with my own eyes. I feel it's wrong. My senses tell me it's wrong. We'll talk about one of the challenges of philosophical ethics in just a second. That's that gut check. Like I know what reality exists out there and I know how I feel about it. So maybe we should just go with that. So it's just sort of an intuitive way of answering questions about the world around us. The problem with that is, of course, it leads to one of the challenges, and this case study highlights that. So in 1960, the average CEO pay was 12 times the average factory worker pay. So the average corporate executive was being paid 12 times higher than the average person on their floor. By 1974, the CEO pay had risen to 35 times the average factory worker. By 1995, the average CEO pay was 135 times average worker's pay. Is there anything wrong with that? Yes.
They're not making 135 times the value compared to that factory worker.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of studies that have suggested that the top paid CEOs oftentimes have the worst results in the corporate world. We're giving them all of this money and we are creating a less balanced and economically diverse economy. Instead of having the vast majority of our population being in the middle class, sort of a bell curve, we now have a bimodal distribution. or maybe a trimodal distribution with a very small middle class. The middle class is shrinking. You have a larger poorer class and, a small wealthy plutocratic class. This kind of question in business ethics and in marketing ethics raises fundamental questions about fairness. And if we use religion to answer this question, again, whose religion are we going to use? If we use a gut check, we could end up with all kinds of different results, which leads to one of the challenges to this discipline overall, which we have to deal with. So those challenges are subjectivism, cultural relativism, and psychological egoism. Subjectivism is the gut check. What subjectivists say is there are no universal truths. Morality is individually determined. It's what we call a solipsistic notion. Solipsism is the philosophical equivalent of narcissism. Narcissism comes from a myth of Narcissus, this beautiful child who looks into a reflecting pool and falls in love with his own image. And you all have heard this term before, right? It's used in psychology now to describe people who are overly concerned about their own sort of position to the detriment of others. And what solipsism says is, I can never really know what it is to be somebody else. And so I just have to rely on my own sense. And because I can't know what it is to be somebody else, I can't walk in somebody else's shoes, then we just need to give up on trying to come up with any a priori universal truths. So as opposed to a posteriori knowledge. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that is gained from the rational mind itself. It doesn't rely on reference to external factors. At the beginning of the class, I asked you, if you have a rectilinear triangle and one side is 3 and one side is 4, we know that the third side, and my art is really bad, has to be 5, right? 2, 3, 5. That's the Pythagorean theorem. Well, how did Pythagoras come up with this? And this is a universal truth. This is something that we can know a priori. He didn't go around, drawing triangles in the dirt. You can see it with the mind's eye. Now, it helps that he was a genius. Most of us don't see that with the mind's eye. It helps that he was really, really smart, right? But you can know this without reference to external factors. And he did. A lot of theoretical physics, for example, is thought up in the mind of theoretical physicists who are coming up with theories about things. How many of you watched, there was a show that was very popular several years ago, and I didn't really like it when it was on, but I started watching it in reruns because my mother started watching it and she insisted that I was the epitome of one of the characters in this television show. Anybody want to guess what the television show was?
Theory.
The Big Bang Theory. And which character do you think she thought I was?
Sheldon.
I was Sheldon. She insisted that I was Sheldon because I had all of these sort of, as a child particularly, kind of solipsistic, narcissistic ideas. And was probably somewhere on the autism spectrum, right? Hopefully I've overcome some of that. I'm not sure if I have or not. I have never been diagnosed with it, but based on reading, the factors of the autism scale and stuff like that, I'm pretty certain that I have something called sensory processing disorder, which is where you can't certain things trigger extreme reactions to you. For me, it was textures, particularly, and smells. I mean, if I smell something, you know, I have like a horrible time cleaning out cat litter boxes because the smell, like I throw up. I mean, literally every time I have to go clean out a cat litter box. I got rid of 2 cats recently. Didn't really want to, but was having some issues with my business that led to me having to rehome them. I've never done that before. I've never rehomed an animal. But every time I would have to go clean out the litter box, I'd literally be going, you know, gagging. I couldn't wear anything that was scratchy. Every sheet had to be washed multiple times before my mother could put it on my bed because it had to be soft rather than, you know, stiff and hard. So this character, you know, Sheldon is pretty narcissistic, but he's a theoretical physicist, right? So at the end of Big Bang Theory, if you've watched the show, he wins a Nobel Prize, and he develops this theory along with his wife, Amy Farrah Fowler, that then has to be proven by experimental physicists. And it turns out the experimental physicists that prove his theorem are, you know, kind of frauds, and they stumbled upon it by accident. And that's the whole kind of premise of the last season. So subjectivists would say, look, we can't really know anything like we can know this Pythagorean theorem. We can't know anything about ethics that way because I can't ever really understand what it's like to be somebody else, to walk in somebody else's shoes. We can't truly, according to subjectivists, ever really be empathetic or sympathetic because we don't know what it's like to be somebody else. And so how can we develop these if we ask really tough questions like, should you be able to market? One of the things that they started marketing in Europe long before they started marketing it in the United States was something called RU486. That was a therapeutic medicine that resulted in spontaneous abortion, or what we call miscarriage. And in places like the United States, this has become very controversial. We have recently seen the Supreme Court overturn decades of precedent. In 1973, the Supreme Court decided that abortion was a right. And that was pretty controversial. Now, if I ask you about like marketing something like RU486, which is sometimes referred to as the morning after pill, I bet we'd have all kinds of different opinions in this classroom. I'm not going to ask you these questions because I don't want to I want to have a debate, but this is one that's so emotionally charged that it could become unproductive very, very quickly. Because you have opinions all the way ranging from you should have abortion available up to, you know, almost the time of birth, and those that would say absolutely not in any circumstance. And most people fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. They're willing to say at least, I think something like 79% of Americans think that in cases of rape, incest, or the health of the mother, there should be an exception. Now, when we talk about that exception, even that health of the mother could be a big exception. What's going to qualify as health of the mother? Well, in the past, I think we would have thought about health of the mother as being her physical well-being. So, for example, she's diabetic and will have a difficult pregnancy, and that could result in maybe even death. Well, now, if you make an exception for health of the mother, what about mental health? We know a lot more about, what if somebody says, you know, if I have to do this, I'm I'm going to harm myself? I don't know, these are really difficult questions. And that's why subjectivism is so intuitively appealing. The problem with it is that if we accept it as true, then we could never build a society. If everybody could come up with their own rules and laws, we would have anarchy. Hobbes imagines this in a book called Leviathan, in which he imagines the state of nature. Now, when I was a kid, before I knew a lot about philosophical ethics, I thought this would be really pretty cool to have no government, to have anarchy. Because like lots of little boys, I had a lot of pent up anger and aggression issues. And I thought I knew who the evildoers were, and I thought that I should be able to take them out. That's not an atypical emotion for children whose frontal cortex is not completely developed, particularly males. At least that's what I'm told. My mother didn't have me tested, so I don't know if I'm normal, right? If we had this no government and an anarchy system, it would be what Hobbes imagines the state. And he says, in the state of nature, it is a war of all against all. You can have no progress. Because if I can't trust people to fulfill their obligations, I can't build anything. Now, maybe it's okay if you're the top dog. Lions are the only feline species that live in a group. Most felines are solitary creatures. They don't really like each other. That's why cats are one of the few animals that you can have and just have one of them, of the mammal species, because they really don't care about other cats for the most part. But lions are an exception. They live in a pride. And it's good to be the male lion in the pride, because the females, the lionesses, do all of the work. And the male takes what he wants. But how many of you have watched Animal Planet or Discovery or something like that and know anything about male lions and their pride? What happens when the male lion gets to a certain point where he can't defend his territory anymore?
They like kick him out of the pride.
A younger male will come in and take over. And when that younger male comes in, if they've just had cubs, he will destroy all of the cubs of the older lion. This is that state of nature where we can't live like this. You know, it would not allow for us to be sitting in this. If I had to fear for my life, I have a concealed carry permit. I got it for a variety of reasons. You know, not the least of which was I just wanted to see what kind of people were getting concealed carry permits. And it was really interesting when I took the class on concealed carry. They asked at the beginning, they're like, if you are convicted of a felony, you can't get a concealed carry permit. And about half of the class got up and left. You can't do this. If you've been convicted of domestic abuse, and another few people got up and left the class. If I had to worry about whether or not you were going to shoot me because you didn't like today's lecture, I'm probably not going to be doing this, right? What allows us to come together in this building, which is enormously complex, is the ability to have standards and rules by which we all agree. And yet we might find really difficult questions. There are really difficult questions in physics that we don't have answers to. And there are really difficult questions in ethics where it seems that we don't have answers to, but we can come up with some general ideas about things that we don't necessarily have to experience in order to know that they're probably wrong or put ourselves in other people's positions, right? We can probably know them a priori. So a second form that tries to fix the problems with subjectivism is called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism says, now look, and Hobbes talks about this in Leviathan. It says, now look, we can't rely on the individual to come up with what's right or wrong, but we can rely on the society. And so societal rules are what's important. So we'll look to society and their rules. And that's what will determine. So again, now with regard to this question of knowledge and conduct and governance, well, what are we going to do? We're going to go to the law book, the law code, and look at what the society says. And if one society says that's okay, homosexuality was rampant in ancient Greece. Okay, maybe that's okay. Not throughout all of the polis, but throughout some of them, Athens in particular. I think the Spartans, have commentary on the Athenians on that note. Well, okay, we'll say that's okay. You go to the law book. Is there a law that's against it? Well, we have laws in the United States until a case called Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas came along, which I think is a 2005 case. Texas. (2003). It was close. 2 years off. Until Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas came along, the Supreme Court in 1986, I do remember this date, in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, said, and the Chief Justice in his opinion wrote, if our society cannot condemn homosexuality, we would be going against 5 millennium of moral teaching. 1986, lots of states had anti-sodomy laws. 2003, Lawrence and Gardner versus Texas does away with those. Now, we might see a change back. One of the things that he intimated in his opinion overturning Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the progeny of Roe, Justice Thomas wrote that we should review all substantive due process cases. But the nice thing about cultural relativism as opposed to subjectivism is we can say, okay, that's not okay in the United States, but it's okay in ancient Greece. You go to the law code, and the law code can be changed. We just update it, but people know what the rules are. So again, we're going to return to the book for the question of what it is we can know. Now, those cases are pretty hard because people don't know, what people are doing behind closed doors for the most part, right? And the way that Bowers versus Hardwick gets to the Supreme Court is interesting. It's as a result of a police raid based on a faulty warrant into the home of Michael Hardwick. And he's caught, in bed with another man and then charged under Georgia's sodomy statute. But those are like very rare cases, right? But again, we can go to the book and we can look at the book and say, what's the book say? What's wrong with this? Just, like recognizing that societies are different. And we recognize in the United States, throughout the 50 states, there were different sodomy laws. Some states did away with them long before 2003. Places like California did away with them. Is morality culturally specific? Now, this again leads to a nice doctrine called legal positivism, which legal positivism, which Chief Justice William Rehnquist wrote a lot about. That all you did was you looked at the law. So again, we went to the codes in 1986, and the state of Georgia had a statute, a criminal statute that defined sodomy in a certain way, and then they could charge people with those codes. And if the majority decides that they want to kick the legislature out and overturn those codes, well, then the majority can do that. And that's what we should do. Right? Let the majority rule win. The problem, again, with this is that it can lead to extreme examples where we can say, you can't tolerate that. That goes beyond the pale. What's an example of something that we can't tolerate? Well, Nazi Germany. Like you can't exterminate a huge section of your population based on completely arbitrary characteristics that are not rational. And if you take cultural relativism as being true, we couldn't say that. We couldn't have said in the Nuremberg trials, you have committed crimes against humanity. We couldn't say in the trials against the Japanese officials that undertook and waged war in World War II, you have committed atrocities against humanity. And I think most of us would agree, again, that we should, respect for diversity should be encouraged. There's lots of diversity. When I started teaching here at UCO, we had very little diversity in our student population. It was largely, Caucasian. The average age of our freshmen was 29, so it was older. It was an older population. Yeah, we see a lot more diversity now. So we should have respect for diversity, but there are some things against which, again, a priori, we can know that you shouldn't do. You don't have to experience death to know that you probably don't want to die. Voltaire talks about this in a book called Candide. If you want to read kind of a pithy work on, with some philosophy, you can read Voltaire's Candide in one sitting. It's very, very small. And it's a commentary, basically, a satirical commentary on sort of the state of humanity. Candide is the main protagonist, and he gets kicked out of his kingdom because he falls in love with the Baron Thunder Tan Trunk's daughter, whose name is Cunigond. And the Baron catches them in a compromising position and kicks Candide out, literally with powerful blast to his rump, out of the kingdom. We're told that the kingdom is so fabulous that it has a castle, and the castle even has a door and a few windows. That's how wonderful it is. You can see the satire here from Voltaire, right? So he has all the rest of the book trying to find or get back with his beloved Cunigond. And at one point, they are reunited, and they come across an old woman who they start telling these tales of woe. Candide goes all over the world. Some of his adventures are great, some of them are not. He visits in the New World a place called El Dorado, that the gold is so plentiful that the natives just leave it lying around on the ground, which is what they thought, the New World was when Christopher Columbus sort of found or refound, however you want to look at it, this continent that was not well known outside, out in the Western world at the time. And they start telling stories And Cunegonde says, well, unless you've had 2 lovers and 2 mothers and 2 fathers killed before your very, very eyes and been whipped in an auto da fe, you can't have had a worse life than me. And the woman says, Mademoiselle, if I were to show you my behind, you wouldn't speak. So it turns out the old woman, who's hideous and ugly and her nose now touches her chin and she's wrinkled and horrible, is the daughter of a pope. She says, I didn't always look like this. Needless to say, popes aren't supposed to have daughters, but she's the daughter of a pope and she's supposed to be married to a prince. And on the way to meet this prince, she gets captured by pirates who enslave her. And then she goes through these trials and tribulations. They get shipwrecked, the pirates do. And in order to survive, they engage in some form of cannibalism by cutting off one of her butt cheeks and using it as nourishment. And she says, at the end of this, one of the points is that she says, you know, I 1,000 times, then she's sold into slavery again, and all of these things happened to her. And she says, 1,000 times I wanted to throw my life off, but I kept on living and I kept on loving life. And in fact, I've known only a handful of people that have actually taken their own lives. And she lists 5, concluding with a German professor named Robeck. In fact, there was a German professor, Robeck, who wrote a thing on suicide and then committed suicide. You don't have to experience death to know that you probably don't want. I mean, most of us cling to life, even at the end, until the very end. If you've ever taken care of a relative, you would know this. They continue to want to live. And so you don't have to know death in order to know that you want to live. And if you can extrapolate from that, that because I want to live, probably everybody else wants to live, and very few people commit suicide, maybe we shouldn't engage in mass extermination of individuals. A third challenge, now the first 2 kind of sound correct. They're easy to dispense with. A third one that's harder is something called psychological egoism. And psychological egoism says that either as a result of nurture or nature, we can't help but behave the way that we behave. We think we have free will, but free will is really illusory. You don't really have free will. You think you have free will. And I used to, you know, I used to do this experiment in class, but since we're running, you know, kind of short on time, I'll just tell you about it. I used to say, what makes a male different than a female genetically? The geneticists over in biology would be horrified at my oversimplification of this, but it's a Y chromosome, right? That's the thing that makes us different. And then I would say, I want everybody who has a Y chromosome to raise their hand, and everybody would raise their hand who was a male in my class. And why would they do that? You think you have free will, but everybody did it. I never had a semester where somebody just refused to raise their hand. Well, why would you do that? Now, when I started teaching, there wasn't a lot known, because I've been here for so long, about maybe now that it would be different, because there wasn't a lot known about, you know, gender identity and its fluidity. And so maybe I would have a different response now than I did then. But overwhelmingly, you're going to raise your hand if you've got a Y chromosome. Why? I did this experiment over and over and over again. You would get the same results. Because you follow directions. You're taught from an early age, right? Do what the teacher tells you. They tell you line up at school. Don't shove. Share. Sharing is caring. You remember this from kindergarten, this lesson? Sharing is caring. You do it for a variety of reasons. You thought you had free will, but maybe you don't. So, and there's a guy, a marketing expert, who's a practitioner, not an academic of marketing, who writes a book, since I'm running out of room, I guess I'll erase some of this over here since that's got more space. His name is Martin Lindstrom, and he writes a book called Biology. S-T-R-O-M. And it's B-U-Y-O-L-O-G-Y, not B-I. And he calls this the science of human consumer behavior. What they do is they put people, and we actually did this in my doctoral program, the marketing department shared with the psychology department the purchase of an fMRI machine so we could do these kinds of experiments. They put people under these machines, and then they give them exposure to marketing stimuli and look at what parts of the brain are firing. We would ask surveys, or they, in biology, he does this. He asks surveys about what do you like, what do you not like? And people will, because of social desirability bias, oftentimes say things in surveys, and then it turns out that they behave rather differently in the real world, which has been a big problem for those of us in the social sciences for many years, is that, again, and I think I said this at one point in time in this class, when people say it's not rocket science, no, this is harder than rocket science. Because rocket science operates within very well-known laws of physics, whereas studying people is really hard because there's 1,000 reasons why you might do something. Well, it's becoming easier for us to study you and figure out whether or not you're going to have a positive response to things. So one of the experiments that they do in this book is regarding an advertisement for anti-smoking. And then they take a survey after. So they show these ads. You've probably seen these ads. Let's look at one if I can find it. For non-smoking. Let's see if I can find. So this was one. Let's see if I can find them. Hopefully my live stream won't cut off. It thinks you're. That one's actually pretty calm compared to some of the ones that they showed in this anti-smoking campaign where they had people, who had their limbs amputated, and they showed these to these smokers, this group of smokers. And it turns out that in surveys, they would say things like, oh yeah, that ad made me want to quit smoking right now. And then they would look at they'd show them the ad and look at their brains under the fMRI. And it turns out that the pleasure part of the brain, or what we think is the pleasure, that the latest science thinks is the pleasure part of the brain, is what's firing in the smoker's brain as they watch the ad. They're jonesing to get outside and go smoke a cigarette, even while watching the ad. And so he says, this is a completely ineffective ad. Now, I made an argument because we had to read this book in one of my classes in the doctoral program because it was written by an actual practitioner. And that's what the whole point of this one professor really was interested in is, how much of our stuff gets practical applications and can we work on things that are more useful, that it's not just a debate among those of us who are studying marketing in a very deep and philosophical way. And so he had us look at this and he said, what's your take on Martin Lindstrom's book? And one of the criticisms I had was that there were two things that I noticed about this conclusion. First of all, and his conclusion is that the ad campaign was a miserable failure, as I recall. Because it didn't really impact smokers' behavior. They're showing them these ads, they're saying on surveys, yeah, that makes me want to quit. I don't want to end up like that. And like I said, the one that I just showed you is fairly calm compared to the ones that show, really horribly amputated people. And I said, first of all, just because we can identify one part of the brain, that's the part that we think is associated with pleasure, is firing, we still can't know what people are thinking based on that. So we don't know that the ad is a complete and utter failure. The second thing is that you're assuming that the target for the ad is current smokers. Maybe the target for the ad is future smokers. It's people who you're trying to convince them that this is not, and one of the ads that they did was the ad, the ad companies will tell you that tobacco is cool, that the pretty people smoke. What would you do if you knew you'd end up like this? And they show all of some of the persuasions that have gone through history, the Marlboro Man, and all of these things that were iconic images that make people attracted to smoking. And then it's goes into what if you knew you would end up like this, and it shows a guy who's got horrible amputation. He's sitting in a hospital chair, in a wheelchair, in a hospital, and he's very grayed out. He looks really, really sick. And maybe it's not trying to target the smokers. Maybe it's trying to target your generation. The last time I checked, the number of smokers was decreasing among all demographic groups except one. Yours. Young people. Why? I knew when I was a smoker that it was bad for me. But when you're, stressed out and you're in law school, you think, well, I'll quit. I can do this while I'm young, I'll quit. It's really, really hard. Really, really, really hard to quit. So maybe the ads are aimed at conditioning people at earlier and earlier ages to not actually engage in things. So it doesn't tell us actually what they're thinking. Psychological egoism also relies on a logical fallacy, which is confusing or equivocating on two words. This is a logical part of the lecture for today, in that it is equivocating on the way people feel with what they actually do. And it also doesn't tell us what to do when people are horribly conflicted. People are oftentimes very conflicted in the choices that they have to make. And they don't always act in their own self-interest, the way psychological egoists would suggest that we do. So all of these have three fatal flaws that make them, and the reason we talk about this is when you write your essays for the exams, you got to avoid these three fatal flaws associated with this. They allow for extreme exceptions. They allow for me to claim I'm special or my group is special. So they rely on exceptionalism. They're not based on reason. They're based on gut intuition. And it's oftentimes very, very frequent that what our guts tell us, this has been shown over and over again, is not true. And it doesn't allow for the development of universal principles. So what would be theories that allow for these? Well, they would be the opposite of that, right? So we would have to have a theory that is not based on exceptions, that applies rules evenly. That's one criterion. Now, we could get this again if we use mythology or religion to base our rules. We could get this based on something that's arbitrary and capricious. why, I mean, if you look at the rabbinic scholars on the Old Testament and their commentary on homosexuality, it's radically different than the Christian perspective on this question. The rabbinic scholars tell us that the prohibitions in the Bible against homosexuality were really about allowing a nation to grow. The Hebrews were a small sect of people surrounded by hostile tribes. And it was about allowing a nation to grow. Which is why when you read the Bible, you have to think, the faith of the Holy See, for many, many years, the Catholic Church said that ordinary people shouldn't be reading the Bible because they usually get it wrong. And I'm convinced we usually do. So looking at the scholarship, I think, is important in understanding these things. So again, relying on, we can have something that allows for no exceptions, like Leviticus, 20. But is that based on something rational? I don't know. So you want it to be based on reason, something rational, not something arbitrary. If you look at the holiness codes in Leviticus, just a few lines up and below the prohibition above Leviticus 20 are prohibitions against wearing linen and wool together. It was an abomination to plant two seeds in the same field, two different crops in the same field. It was an abomination for a Jew to eat a shellfish. So we have to think about something that's not based on, that just doesn't allow for exceptions. It's also got to be based on something that's reasonable and uses logic and critical thinking to achieve the development of an ethical theory. And then finally, if you have these first two, you should be able to develop something that is universal. And so the theories that we'll talk about now, that we'll turn to now, do these. They allow for the development of universal principles or ideas or rules based on reason that don't allow for exceptions, unlike the three challenges to philosophical ethics. Did the Greeks invent philosophy? I think there's pretty good evidence that can be made that in the Western world, yes, they did. They invented philosophy. Now, why did they invent philosophy? Why did it come about in this particular part of Athens, in this particular part of Greece and Athens, at about the same time? We get three of the greatest minds of the Western intellectual tradition, all forming at sort of the same time and place. The first of which, and the first fully worked out system of philosophy that answers these three questions, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance, is found in Plato's Republic. Now, what Plato says he did and what he actually did, I'm not sure that we can know for sure, but I'm not sure we should take him at his word at it. Plato says, all I did was follow Socrates around and write down what he came up with. He was my teacher, and that's what I did. I just followed him around. So we know about Socrates from two sources. His most famous student, Plato, he didn't write anything on his own. Socrates would not get tenure in an academic institution today because he didn't write anything down. He just walked around and asked questions. And in Republic, he asks a group that's at a party this question. What is justice? They're at this party, they're drinking, they're having a good time. And, he asks, he regales, and, an old guy says, it's great to be old and wealthy because now I can sit around and think about, these ultimate questions of meaning of life. What is justice? And he gives some answer, and Socrates dispenses with that, and then he kind of goes off, and some more people come along, some other interlocutors, Thrasymachus and others come along, and they give their ideas. And so Socrates says, well, what we want to do, each of them gives these kinds of answers, and he dispenses with most of them. One of them says, well, it's the will of the stronger. This goes to the cultural relativist, right? If I have power over you, I develop the rules and you're going to do what I say because I have the power. And Socrates says, well, the problem with that is that you may not always have the power. And we want the absolute concept of justice. And the second problem with that is that with the will of the stronger, we are allowing for this culturally relativistic application of the rules, right? So I'm going to be the king. I'm going to develop a society. We're going to follow my rules. By the way, this is the most efficient. American forms of government are not terribly efficient. I say this as a former political scientist, right? What's the most efficient form of government? It's a dictatorship. I'm wearing the OML conference starts today. I'm a city councilman in Guthrie, my hometown. Was served 2 terms as vice mayor there. I'm going to OML. I can tell you that sitting on a council with 6 other people is very difficult. We're trying to pass an ordinance right now, and it's like putting 7 scorpions in a bottle and shaking it up. Trying to get 7 people to come to an agreement on anything is enormously difficult. It's much easier to have a dictatorship, to just say, this is the way it is, and carry out the rule tomorrow, right? Like, this is the law, I'm writing it down, the Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Draco, and it's gonna be enforced like that. Now, if it's difficult for 7 people to write an ordinance, how difficult is it for how many members of the United States Congress? Anybody know how many members of the United States Congress there are? Well, huh?
You're like 100 and something.
No. There's 100 and some in what?
House of Reps.
Senate.
The Senate. There's 100 and some in the Senate. There are 435 in the United States House. 535 members of Congress. Now, if I can't get 6 other people to go along with me, how are you possibly going to get 535? I mean, this is not at all efficient, is it? And our system of government lacks some elements of democracy because the Senate is not democratic. The House is completely democratic because everybody gets just 1 vote, and they limit debate and things like that. So Socrates in Republic comes up with this idea of answering this first question of what is it I can know? Well, since this is a really abstract concept, justice, and if I asked you to, what is justice today, and there's an exercise for you to do on what is justice in marketing. What is the ultimate application of ethics, in other words, justice, in the discipline of marketing? We would come up with lots of different answers, and this seems really, really hard. That's where Socrates comes up with this formula for what we can know, right? So we had this discussion in the beginning of class where I asked what this was, and we had a hard time just coming up with the definition of what this is. Most of you, I said it's a table. I said, why is it a table? It's not being used as a table. Tables are generally used for things like eating. Although you've got your milk there, you're not eating on them. You're using it more as a desk. So why isn't it a desk? And you said, well, it doesn't have drawers. And we went through this exercise, and I'm like, no tables have drawers. I gave you an example. So if we can't understand, well, Socrates says there are people who can understand this. There is a perfect ideal of everything, and it's found in the realm of the forms. Imagine this, this is the best worked allegory in all of literature, probably. It's called the allegory of the cave. Imagine there are these people that are trapped in a cave. They're held in such a way that they really can't see each other. All they can see is the end of the cave where there's a wall and there's a large fire behind them. And people are walking in front of the fire and with various objects and things like that. And who becomes the leader in these is to the extent that they can develop a society living in this cave. Well, it's the people who become good at predicting what the next object in front of them is going to be. But if you took one of those people and you forced them out of the cave, you know, if you turn them around towards the fire, once their eyes adjusted to the light, they would realize that everything that they thought was real was really an illusion. When you take them to the opening of the cave and into the sunlight, they're going to realize that really everything that they thought before was an illusion. Yes.
Okay, so it sounds like we're kind of trying to find like a happy medium between like subjectivism, or I guess I'm just trying to like ask like what we're going for. Cause I think we can all agree that like everyone's gonna have a different opinion and everything's gonna be subjective. But then like I look at things like religion and that's like me personally, like putting like beliefs aside, it seems like the only place where we can find like objective like rules or morals, whatnot. So like what's like the in-between here, like, or like what kind of satisfies
Well,
both sides?
that's a really good question, because what we can say about the theories that we'll talk about, like Republic, Plato's Republic, is that they do have problems. We can find problems with all of them. This idea of the realm of the forms, we can find where is this realm of the forms exist? Well, it exists with certain people who are really smart, like Pythagoras, who could figure out that if you had a rectilinear triangle with 3, 4, and 5, right, you had a rule. You can figure it out in the mind's eye. They're able to see in the realm of the forms the perfected definition of something. So they're able to see the perfected idea of justice. Most of us are still back in the cave, being deluded every day by all kinds of things, by all kinds of manipulation. So he comes up with this idea of the philosopher king. This is the person, not all of us can see this, but this person is going to be able to see the ideal of justice. And based on that, he comes up with a whole society that he says, and it's called Republic because he lays the foundation for this form of governance that's based on this idea of a philosopher king. And in a republican form of government, what you have is you have elements of a monarchy, elements of an aristocracy. So he calls the philosopher king the men of gold, the aristocracy, the men of silver, and then the rest of us, most of us are the men of bronze. Now, the first time I read Republic, and it's easy to read, it's like a play. There are characters and they're interacting. I was like, this is the stupidest this came. But then you think about it and you realize, there are things that we can find again a priori, right? That we can know a priori. So, there are problems, and one of the problems that Socrates has to address is that at the end of Republic, he has to admit that he's probably not going to get this ideal form of government, that it'll never come into existence. But his response to that and his reply to that is, that's beside the point. You don't need the philosopher to tell you what is happening. You need the philosopher to tell you what the best is. So we get to this question, one of the things that we have to think about in marketing ethics is there a difference between most preferred and preferred by most? Probably. Most preferred is what the majority would want. If you asked a group of children whether or not they want shots, they're going to say no. But most states, with one glaring exception now, require that if you go to school, you gotta get these shots. And the people who are administering the shots would argue that that's what's the most preferred outcome. Because before we had these vaccines for like polio, people were crippled. We had a president who suffered from polio and was a spry young man, develops polio and couldn't walk. Was in, pretty much a wheelchair for the rest of his life. One of the greatest American presidents. And then years later, we come up with this vaccine for polio and it seems to work. I'm out of time, so I will stop there. Let me stop the tape, and if you got ducks, come see me so I can give you your duck grade.